The 16th Division is out of the question. If the 16th is withdrawn, the entire Romanian front will collapse and the situation will never be restored.
There is only one chance for implementing Clause 3, Operation Thunderstrike, and it must begin on special order.
The 11th Panzer Division had 57 here below. It's gone up there with 73 or 75.
The assistance promised by the Führer has come. After many days of fighting, the D-blocking army overcame the opposing Russians. Now, it is on the threshold of our fortress.
As we saw in the last episode, after its encirclement, the whole of the Sixth Army was anxiously awaiting Manstein's rescue operation, codenamed Vendigewetter. General Paulus, who was not the least anxious, tried to reassure his men. On the 30th of November, he addressed them again.
Today the Führer appointed me to the rank of Colonel General. I see this as a credit to the troops subordinated to me in the course of the fierce battle of the last months, and especially the last days. While we do not know what the enemy still intends, we must justify the trust the Führer showed us. To do this, we must gather all our strength and persevere in overcoming difficulties. The Führer will pull us out.
But at the same time, the Führer's mood was pessimistic. Rommel just told him that Africa was lost, and Göring mentioned a conversation he had with Mussolini. Il Duce declared that the continuation of the war in Russia no longer made any sense, and that the Axis powers must seek a compromise with Stalin, because the real danger was in the Mediterranean. Invaded by doubt, Hitler announced to Zeitzler that he was leaving for the Berghof, this time for a longer stay to put his ideas in order before making new decisions. Extremely worried, his chief of staff noted that the Supreme Leader responded to OKH's suggestions in nothing but 3 ways, all counterproductive: refusal, lack of decision, or contradictory instructions. On the morning of the 12th, when Hoth's panzers set out for Stalingrad, Hitler asked during the Situation Conference if anything catastrophic had happened again.
Down there, it did not make a war of movement. It left the tanks behind and did nothing at all. Position war.
We could have advanced the flanks much further on this front, relatively few. I have clarified this matter of order of withdrawal. It will be slightly attenuated. He wanted to give the order to withdraw. The situation developed here, as Marshal Manstein called me this morning. He holds the bridge at this point. A slight pressure is already exerted on the 23rd Panzer Division, probably because of the reinforcing forces. Here, the resistance has not been too strong. However, during the day, fierce fighting broke out. They took Ritschev. This is very unpleasant because of the bridge, for we wanted to pass through the line of communication. The attack has also spread farther up, whereas here it has, by and large, decreased. We intercepted a radio message from the 8th Cavalry Corps saying that they want to go on the defensive. Here at the top, it is not yet clear what they are actually doing. It can be seen as a reaction to our radio traffic, because it was particularly dense during the days before our intervention. But we can also think that they intend to do something. It was mainly here, at Sixth Armies, that there were attacks. Marshal Manstein called today to fuel this attack, and he, once again, put all this in writing and sent it.
It is 80 kilometers as the crow flies, from the Aksai to the southern edge of the Stalingrad pocket.
He sent that in writing. Perhaps you could read it. The 16th Division is out of the question. If the 16th is withdrawn, the entire Romanian front will collapse and the situation will never be restored. Perhaps he believes, because there is a breach, that the armored forces will be able to get something through. If not, I wonder why he would have made that proposal.
We must wait until we know what forces he has here. He has nevertheless strong divisions, one of 95 tanks and the other of 138.
It is obviously a risk to withdraw 2 divisions.
I agree with that, but he also has Luftwaffe formations, and he has to get something out of it.
When the next infantry division arrives, it will take a lot of time, 8 days before it arrives there. We had hoped that the 11th Panzer Division could have intervened in it. If it cannot get there, it is a fact that the 2 Panzer Divisions will no longer advance. The 23rd will be gnawed on the flank. There will then only remain the 6th, which is a matter of concern, especially if counterattacks occur and if communication is to be maintained. If we remove the 17th from up there, there will also be a risk, but this attack of 2 armored divisions can turn short, and it is possible that after 2 days we are still obliged to bring the 17th, and then we may have lost 1 day.
He wanted to place the 17th here.
He wanted to put it here and take it back.
But the 17th has no value.
Well, then the 11th.
It only has 45 tanks.
It was 49 to date. Some are unavailable. It left a single detachment there, and a regiment of the 306th could be added to it as an emergency measure.
When the 11th lost all these tanks, it had 70 or 80 up there.
From what I know, it came down with 49 tanks.
There are others which are waiting for repair.
Of course, there are always some that are temporarily unusable. Their numbers will increase again tomorrow because of the weather.
The 11th Panzer Division had 57 here below. It's gone up there with 73 or 75.
I'll check again. I do not have the number in mind. With the weather, we must always count on 10 to 12 tanks in my experience.
12th of December. In reality, the German offensive began with a promising initial advance. Army Group Hoth's offensive began in the morning from the areas of Kotelnikova and Pimenchany in a northeasterly direction, with its main axis of attack concentrated on a narrow sector of the front along the railroad Tikhorets-Stalingrad. Here, Kirchner's 57th Panzer Corps led the attack with the 6th and 23rd Panzer Divisions, opposed by the 51st Army's 302nd and 126th Rifle Divisions. Romanian cavalry and infantry operated on the flanks of the armoured groups. The connection with 6th Army's troops was planned in the vicinity of Tendodova Junction, east of Zeti. After an artillery preparation, Rouse's tanks broke through the 302nd Rifle Division's defences in the little station of Kumyatsky. The Soviet riflemen offered what resistance they could against the German juggernaut. The large superiority in tanks and aircraft telling, Kirchner's forces quickly developed their offensive. By nightfall, the advanced units of the 6th Panzer Division reached the southern bank of the Aksai River in several places, whilst the 23rd Panzer Division reached the area north of Nebikova. Having secured Gremiachi, the Panzer Grenadiers tried to get through the flank and rear of the 126th Rifle Division, but only managed to push back its right flank regiment. Summing up the results of the first day of the offensive, despite the notable advance, the most important of the goals was not achieved, since the German group failed to secure a bridge across the Aksai River. The Stalingrad Front commander, Colonel General Yeremenko, ordered Trufanov to hold the positions occupied by the 51st Army's troops and to restore the situation in the area of the 302nd Rifle Division. The 235th Flamethrower Tank Brigade and the 87th Rifle Division were sent from the front's reserves to strengthen the army. But the two major Soviet assets available in the region were Tanashushin's 13th Tank Corps and Volsky's 4th Mechanized Corps. The 13th Tank Corps, which was nearest, had moved on from the Aksai Station area and was engaging the 23rd Panzer Division on 57th Panzer Corps' right flank. The 4th Mechanized Corps was located further up the Don River and was to strike 6th Panzer Division on the left flank. As for aviation, the 100 fighter and attack aircraft of the 8th Air Army, allocated in support of the Soviet mobile troops, were about equal in number to those the 8th Flieger Corps had to support the German offensive. For the next 10 days, the skies would be either dragging low cloud with silent snowfalls, or full of raging Stukas and Sturmoviks, raining metal. If 51st Army, with its currently available forces, was in no position to destroy the superior forces put forward by the 4th Panzer Army, it could still slow them down, or maybe contain them on intermediate lines in the path to 6th Army, and bleed them until Malinovsky's troops reached the battlefield, which was consistent with the plan of the Soviet Supreme Command. December the 13th. On the second day of the offensive, 6th Panzer Division seized a bridgehead on the Aksai River at Zalivsky. From there, part of the forces moved on to Verkhneykumsky and captured the village. The 23rd Panzer Division also reached the river and the bridge at Kruglyakov. To slow down the German advance, the 13th Tank Corps was directed to the battle. An intense struggle developed on the Aksai River. But however important its outcome, an even more important decision had already been taken on the Soviet side. As we saw in the last episode, Stavka had redirected General Malinovsky's powerful 2nd Guards Army to march south at maximum speed and to deploy in the rear of the Soviet units operating against the 57th Panzer Corps. Once this was done, Operation Wintergewitter would be put to an end. Yet, until it could reach the theatre of operations, Army Group Hoth's onslaught had to be contained by the 51st Army, the sole force currently opposing Hoth. It consisted of the 4th Mechanized and 13th Tank Corps, along with a handful of units that had been scraped together. Aside from these, there was nothing else between Hoth and Paulus. If Operation Wintergewitter had any chance of success, the window was now or never. Within 5 days, Malinovsky's troops would arrive on the ground, and all hope would be gone. December the 14th. In the early morning, 6th Panzer Division sought to build on its previous success in the area of a little Cossack village of Verkhneykumsky, which would become the focal point of the struggle in the days ahead. It was located on the most convenient road to Stalingrad, in a region where the barren steppe was riddled with ravines and gullies and covered with deep, treacherous snow. Whilst the few Soviet formations directly available in the area were thrown against the German advance to try and slow it down, Volsky's 4th Mechanized Corps was driving at full speed from the north toward the village. The Corps had not yet had time to replenish personnel and material after the November offensive battles. It barely fielded 100 operable tanks, whilst another 50 were in need of repair. Half of them were T-34s, capable of opposing the Mark III and IV Panzers, but the rest were light T-70s, only useful against infantry and armoured cars. Another fight developed on the flank of the German advance, where the 23rd Panzer Division was engaged by the 13th Tank Corps, so that by this time, 2 days after the beginning of the operation, both Panzer Divisions were engaged by Soviet forces. This quick Soviet reaction enabled them to gain precious time at a moment when time was the most needed. For now, the odds for Wintergewitter were still in Germany's favour, as Hoth's Panzer Group largely outnumbered the Soviet forces on the axis of advance. But time was quickly running out. December the 15th. The 4th Mechanized Corps and the 1378th Rifle Regiment, which were to play the most important role in countering Wintergewitter, deployed around the village of Verkhneykumsky. German plans were based on a quick breakthrough using all the available forces before the arrival of the Soviet reserves, breaking the encirclement and connecting with the Stalingrad grouping, something that could only be achieved by acting swiftly. In accordance with Wintergewitter, 6th Army was to attack toward the relief forces when they arrived at a point 30 kilometers from the pocket. An order for the troops to break out of the encirclement was prepared, thus proving 6th Army staff believed this was possible. It ran like this.
The assistance promised by the Führer has come. After many days of fighting, the D-blocking army overcame the opposing Russians. Now it is on the threshold of our fortress. We are required to break through the encirclement and keep the Bolsheviks at bay in the area between the Volga and the Don for a sufficient amount of time. The offensive order is given, Every Army soldier should know about this decision. Those who advance must achieve their goals. Those who defend must restrain all enemy attacks. Now you need to make this last effort.
But, as later events developed, this draft was never issued as an official order. Faced with the stubborn resistance of the Soviets almost 50 kilometers from the target, the Germans made desperate efforts trying to crush this unexpected obstacle standing in their way. Yet the obstacle proved too strong. As a result of a struggle that raged all day long, Volsky's forces finally captured the strategically important village of Verkhneykomsky and pushed 6th Panzer Division's main forces back almost all the way to the Aksai River. In retrospect, we can say that this day, the 15th of December 1942, was the actual checkmate to Operation Wintergewitter. Neither the Germans nor the Soviets knew this yet, but in the wake of this day of fighting, on the brink of this small village, lost in the snowy steppes, the Sixth Army's fate was sealed beyond all hope. Even von Manstein didn't know it, but Wintergewitter was already over. December the 16th. The Stalingrad Front's troops continued to defend their ground stubbornly, gaining time for the 2nd Guards Army to arrive on the Mishkova River to face the 4th Panzer Army. Once again, the German assaults were concentrated at Verkhneykomsky, where the fighting was no less fierce than on the previous day. From dawn to dusk, the 11th Panzer Regiment attacked relentlessly toward the heights south of the village, manned by the 1378th Rifle Regiment. The Soviet gunners and riflemen made the most of their weapons to fight off wave after wave of German assaults, letting the panzers come to close range, or pass them by before firing the ear-splitting rounds of their heavy anti-tank rifles. Now the 50-kilogram weapon they had so much toil carrying in their night and day marches was revealed in all its value. This was their most precious ally as the German tanks turned about, their tracks monstrously screeching on the frozen ground. Between them and the soldiers crouching in their white camouflage uniforms, it was who would shoot and hit first. But, just as the day before, all German efforts were frustrated. Neither at Verkhneykomsky nor at Kruglyakov could they break the Soviet resistance. And, if on the day before von Manstein still had some hope of success, he hardly had any left now, because the Red Army had just launched Operation Little Saturn against the Italian 8th Army on the Don River. The head of Army Group Don could not ignore the maximal threat this caused to all his troops, in fact to the entire German front in southern Russia. From now on, von Manstein's attention was to shift more and more away from Wintergewitter and concentrate on preventing an even more tremendous catastrophe than the one still looming at Stalingrad. December the 17th. Once again the German offensive resumed at first light, throwing everything into the battle. All day long, panzers and grenadiers, supported by artillery and aircraft, frantically tried to overcome the gap between the Aksai and Mishkova rivers. Tension mounted with each passing hour. At the end of the day, despite some progress, no decisive breakthrough had been obtained. The only positive note was the arrival of the 17th Panzer Division on the Aksai River, deploying for action the next day. But on the Soviet side, the first units of the 2nd Guards Army began to arrive on the Mishkova River. By this time, the hamlet of Verkhneykomsky had already entered history's Hall of Fame of decisive battles. It was in this obscure settlement, lost in the middle of the frozen steppe and halfway between the two small rivers, that one of the major battles of the Stalingrad campaign had taken place. December the 18th. After crossing the Aksai River, the 17th Panzer Division joined the fighting at Verkhneykomsky. All available tanks of the 6th Panzer Division also went into the attack, along with motorized forces, supported by intense shelling and airstrikes. At the end of the day, the Germans had advanced several kilometers, surrounding the village from east and west, but still without achieving a decisive gain, even after 4 days of extremely hard fighting. Once again, the Soviet resilience prevailed against all assaults. The area around the hamlet had become a nightmarish battlefield, black from fire and smoke, littered with the wreckage of tanks, some with their engines still running. In the evening, Volsky received a message from the Stalingrad front, informing him that the defenders of Verkhneykomsky had been awarded the Guards title. The 4th Mechanized Corps became the 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps. At that same moment, Colonel General Paulus had an important exchange with Field Marshal von Manstein over the radio. Recording of radio conversation between Field Marshal von Manstein and Colonel General Paulus at 17:30 hours on the 18th of December 1942.
Are all the gentlemen here?
Yes, sir.
If you please, let's have a short review of Major Eisman's information.
Option 1. When breaking through to Buzanovka, establishing a connection with Group Hot will only be possible using tank forces, since there is not enough infantry and all of it will be occupied to hold Stalingrad and a new front along the flanks of the breakthrough. In this case, all the reserves of the fortress will be directed to the breakout site. Option 2. A breakthrough without establishing a connection with Group Hot as a last resort only. It will imply the loss of a large quantity of materiel. It will also be necessary to fly in fuel and food. For the fighting effectiveness of men, it would be better to establish the junction with Group Hot and get supply convoys. The infantry is now less and less mobile every day, as horses had to be ridden on provisions. Option 3. Further defense in the occupied area requires sufficient supplies to be flown in. Until now, these were completely inadequate. As a consequence, it's no longer possible to consider this option.
How long is needed to prepare the actions under Option 2?
3 to 4 days.
How much fuel and food is needed to reach the Mishkova?
Calculation of fuel is carried out by the Chief Quartermaster of Army Group Don. Reduced food rations for 270,000 men over 10 days.
According to the previous order, next discussion at 2300 hours. Many thanks. Are there any other questions?
Can the Corps be allowed to think about preparing Option 2? Second question. What is going on with Group Hot?
1. Let's discuss tonight. 2. Group Hoth continues to advance at Verkhneykomsky, covering the bridgehead at Kruglakov. To the south, there are strong enemy troops.
No more questions. Many thanks.
December the 19th. The intense struggle between the Aksai and Mishkova rivers was now at its peak. After a strong artillery and Stuka bombardment, the 17th Panzer Division took the heights northwest of Verkhneykomsky. At the same time, the 6th Panzer Division converged on the village from several directions at once. His forces threatened with encirclement. At last, Volsky gave the order to leave Verkhneykomsky. The fortitude of the 51st Army's troops in these battles played a major role in the Soviet defense against Wintergevita. Their heroic deeds enabled the 2nd Guards Army to arrive in the region, unload from its 150 train echelons, and deploy properly on the Mishkova River. So by the time the 57th Panzer Corps finally reached this line, strong Soviet formations had taken up positions on its northern bank. In the evening, Paulus and von Manstein talked again over the radio. Radio communication between Field Marshal von Manstein and Colonel General Paulus at 18:15 hours on December the 19th, 1942.
Good afternoon, Paulus. Kirchner is making good progress today. He reached the Mishkova. He received the order to develop the offensive. I draw your attention to the fact that there is only one chance for implementing Clause 3, Operation Thunderstrike, and it must begin on special order. Major Eisman described the general situation to me, and I fully understood the complexity. Regarding the orders given, we'll talk again tonight. That's all I wanted to say.
I want to briefly describe the current situation. Today there was fighting with mixed success in the southern part of the Western Front and on the Southwestern Front. The enemy attacked with a force of 70 to 80 tanks. Strong enemy air support. There were several breakthroughs in the depth of the defense. In several places, small wedges have already been eliminated. Especially critical is the situation in Marinovka. where the enemy reached the western outskirts with a force of 20 tanks, as well as the southern outskirts of the river. The tanks and assault units prepared for the breakthrough had to be used in today's fighting instead. In the direction of Kalach, an increase in the enemy strength was detected, especially artillery and tanks. Supplies arrived today in sufficient quantities, 128 aircraft with 220 tons of cargo.
Sincere congratulations for the success of the defense. Good luck.
Thank you. Will there be an order?
There will be one immediately.
In fact, there would be no such order. December the 20th. After 6 days fighting around Verkhneykumsky, the 4th Panzer Army's lead elements finally reached the Mishkova River. At the furthermost point of the German advance, it was less than 50 kilometers to 6th Army. Tank crews could now catch a glimpse of the Stalingrad skyline and its gloomy flares in the distance. But they didn't know it was already too late. From the 20th to the 23rd of December, the 3 weakened panzer divisions would try in vain to overcome the Soviet resistance in several sectors of the river line, desperately switching their efforts from one to another. 17th Panzer Division at Gromoslavka, 6th Panzer Division at Vasilievka, and the 23rd Panzer Division at Krukliakov and Kapkinka. But to no avail. Obviously, and according to its own commander, 4th Panzer Army had now clearly expended all its reserves, and could do no more without reinforcements. On the 23rd it was already on the defensive, and the last week of December 1942 saw the Wintergewitter offensive become an all-out retreat. The 2nd Guards Army, now fully regrouped behind the Mishkova River, released its own offensive with 10 times the number of tanks than what remained in the 4th Panzer Army, and 4 times the number of troops, now with boosted morale and high spirits, as opposed to the wavering Germans and Romanians. To the 4th Panzer Army the question was not to try and withstand the new Soviet offensive, but to escape it. Fighting went on in difficult conditions. Now there were real winter storms. Blizzards circled over the Kalmyk steppe, and roads were covered with snowdrifts. In 3 days all the ground gained with great efforts during the German advance was lost. The broken remnants of the Wintergewitter formations had retreated all the way back to their initial positions. Most of the fighting took place in the sector of Kotelnikovo, the strategic town from which the rescue operation had begun 2 weeks earlier. By the morning of the 29th of December, the Soviet 7th Tank Corps finally secured the town. The remnants of the once proud 4th Panzer Army were now retreating straight towards Rostov. Just as in 1941, German troops ended the year 1942 in full retreat on that part of the front they were eagerly conquering only 6 months before, so confident in their might and success. For a full transcript of the radio communications between Army Group Don and 6th Army during this critical period, watch our video Breakout from Stalingrad, with very special thanks to Tick for the voiceover.